The mainstream media goes crazy, and are we entering a new Cold War? And of course, the dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials, and the Millennials joining me today are Garrick Ross and Ryan the Squirrel Brady.
Howdy.
And of course, Christopher Hopkins, our assistant producer, and Adam Katora, our producer. So first up, the mainstream media is going crazy because President Trump is constantly having these press conferences, and it's apparently helping his numbers, so they're going crazy. And Rachel Maddow actually went as far as to say that he shouldn't even be allowed to have those. Pretty crazy, obviously, that someone in the mainstream media that considers themselves a hard news reporter would say that. We have a clip on it. I know it's hard to listen to Rachel Maddow. It's really hard for me to listen to her as well. But here's the clip.
By the president, by recognizing that when he is talking about the coronavirus epidemic, more often than not, he is lying. Even when he's talking about what he has done or what he will do, he is consistently lying and giving you happy talk that is stuff that the federal government isn't actually doing. And it's making people around the country count on the fact that the federal government is doing that stuff when they're not. I mean, there may be other people in the federal government who are saying things that are true, but these daily briefings from the White House are a litany of things from the president that would be awesome if they were true, if they were happening, but they're not. And so the sooner we come to terms with that, I think the better for all of us. If it were up to me, and it's not, I would stop putting those briefings on live TV. Not out of spite, but because it's misinformation. If the president does end up saying anything true, you can run it as tape. But if he keeps lying like he has been every day on stuff this important, all of us should stop broadcasting it. Honestly, it's going to cost lives.
Yeah, so there you have it. So Rachel Maddow, Millennials, is basically saying that the President of the United States should not be kept on the news to have these news conferences because he's telling lies. And only Rachel Maddow should decide what is true and what's not true. Instead of just reporting what is happening, which is what a reporter is supposed to do, she's basically saying, no, we don't want to hear him. Thoughts, Millennials?
Rachel Maddow is an entertainment host, not a journalist. She is MSNBC's version of Sean Hannity. So, I mean, I'm going to take everything she says with a huge grain of salt, and a lot of it's just provocative, trying to get those ratings because she's competing with
Because they have no ratings.
Because they have no ratings.
No one listens to her.
Yep. I think her whole argument is kind of based on Trump not being the best speaker when he's at those press conferences because he's just, he doesn't really come off as like the presidential speaker that you would have like with President Obama.
He's not scripted.
He's not scripted. Which I guess if he was saying this is a script, it's been approved by CDC, it totally disarms her argument outright. But, you got to take, I believe what the president is saying is true, but if he said things a little bit better and didn't present it the way he's doing it now, like I'm trying to do off script. But here, I think she doesn't really have any room to stand in.
And also,
go ahead, Gary.
I was going to say, it's just a little funny to me, though, because for the longest time, Maddow would be like, we don't get to hear from the president. We don't get to see his press conferences. He doesn't give press conferences. And now he's giving hour-and-a-half press conferences, and it's too much for them. So no matter what he does, he's just going to be in the wrong.
The same thing, damned if you do, damned if you don't, especially with the whole response to the coronavirus. They hit him on the head for that. It's like, well...
Yeah, exactly.
What's funny is Trump just had his most recent... news conference, of course, you look and you see the media and they're all spread out. So it's really kind of funny seeing them spread out. So there's one gentleman just asked him a question and Trump goes, oh, wait a minute. What media outlet are you from? And the guy goes, Bloomberg News. He goes, oh, tell Mike Bloomberg I said hi.
That's funny. That's funny.
And I think this drives them crazy. This is part of the Rachel Maddow nut job comments about he shouldn't be on the news and shouldn't have these kinds of news conferences because they hate the fact that he's funny. He's entertaining.
And to that point, though, he's not getting up there and he's not espousing doom and gloom and saying, the world's going to die tomorrow. He's going out there and he's saying, hey, this is what's happening. But these are the steps that we're taking. Whether Maddow agrees with whether those steps are legitimate or not is a point of, I think, political debate aside. And it's not based on reality because after he's done, you have Fauci and you got Birx who come up, who are some of the finest scientists in world history here. And they're saying much of the same thing that Trump is saying and or correcting the record a little bit, which I can appreciate because Trump does go a little off script and say things.
Yeah. And you have the ultimate technocrat, which is Mike Pence. I mean, he's
Yes.
the ultimate technocrat.
It's like good cop, bad cop.
Absolutely.
You know, Trump gets out there and he's like, "Hey, how we doing?" And he makes jokes like you were talking about how he was like, tell Mike I said hi." The first half of his speech on this is just him going out there and being like, "Oh man, I've never seen this room quite like this before. It's kind of nice. Maybe we'll keep it like this after."
So straight from the nursing home, Joe Biden is asked a question.
What's Joe doing today?
Because of course he is, at home like pretty much everybody else, except for us on this podcast, apparently. But he's at home, and so naturally he is asked questions, and there's a media delay. And of course, that's one of the problems now when you hear these interviews, because there's a media delay and it's kind of complicated to watch or listen to. We've cut all of that stuff out, of course. But you have to listen to what Biden's answer is about COVID-19 and the cure. It makes no sense. It makes no sense. And this guy is the best they can give. We have a clip on this, and here it is.
This is Sarah Haynes. In Hot Topics, we talked about Trump saying the government would reassess the recommended period for keeping businesses shut and people at home. Are you at all concerned, as Trump said, that we cannot let the cure be worse than the problem itself?
We have to take care of the cure. That will make the problem worse no matter what.
What was that?
Millennials, please tell me what he just said.
I don't know.
Nation of 320 million people, and this is what we have for a Democratic presidential candidate. Kind of sad.
And he's had probably the easiest path to the nomination in ever. He's just kind of woke up.
Feels like he's propped up. It's like just go. We'll take care of it.
So we're going to go from Trump, people not wanting to hear his long press conferences, to Grandpa Simpson. I mean, that's what it sounds like.
Oh my God, yeah.
I'm sorry. That's probably one of the funniest things I've heard. Proof that this guy is not quite ready for prime time.
Like when he coughed on the Jake Tapper interview on the last podcast we covered. That was pretty funny.
Awesome.
Oh, man. He is just a riot.
He is. And then Joe Scarborough, same thing. The media going crazy. Joe Scarborough talks about vets dying as a result of COVID-19, implying, of course, if not outright saying, that Trump isn't doing anything about that. Oh, yeah, right. We have a clip on that, and here it is.
And it seems that Republicans now are making the argument, let the World War II vets die, let the Korean War vets die, let the Vietnam vets die, let everybody in that generation die, because we're worried about Boeing. We don't want Boeing, who got, by the way, a $17 billion bailout by this package after killing people because of their selfishness, because of their greediness. I mean, all these other countries, all these other companies with stock buybacks, the same thing happened there. We have Republicans. We have people like Lindsey Graham and Rick Scott more concerned about Boeing than unemployed people in their own state. Now,
yeah, but unfortunately, Joe, what you don't understand is that Boeing employs tens of thousands of people.
Yes.
So if Boeing goes under, so do all those jobs, and so does one of the most important parts of our manufacturing base. One of the most important parts. And you want to know one of the reasons why Boeing has been in trouble long before this bailout? They were in trouble because of globalization. They were outsourcing all different kinds of parts from these planes across the globe, and then bringing them back to the manufacturing facility in Seattle, and then assembling them. Gee, what could go wrong?
Plus the 737 MAX incident. Boeing's been hurting for a while, yeah.
Which is part of the globalization and the supply chain. Look, I think all that, bring all the parts back to the United States and make them here. I mean, that's what I think. I think that's just a much better idea. I mean, the manufacturing base in the Midwest would come back alive if we did that.
I just think with Joe's argument, regardless about allowing veterans to die, I don't think anyone doesn't want people to die. And why are you? That's a sensationalism. He's just trying to get people to tune in and say, look at this. We're basically inferring that we want vets to die. It's like, wait, who's been saying that? I don't think so. I think we got to take care of our own here.
Well said. No, well said about the sensationalism, because I really think that that's what we're hearing on NBC, MSNBC, CNN.
CNBC too. You know
CNBC.
that person,
Really?
the head of the Pershing group.
Nice.
Well, no. So the head of the Pershing group he just hedged a $27 million bet made $2.2 billion in profits, like 100,000% return on investment.
Man.
He's been going on CNBC for the last months, espousing doom and gloom and that the market's going to go to zero and you're all going to lose.
While he's sheltered.
While he's sheltered, and meanwhile he secretly hedged a bet and he just cashed out for billions of dollars.
It's ridiculous.
And this is what they're doing. They're going up there, they're being sensational. They want to, because if it bleeds, it prints, and it's the same story over and over again. And so they just want to keep grinding that axe. And look, there are some veterans who died, and George Postis is an interesting character. He's been involved in a lot of presidential administrations in terms of being a World War II ambassador, and he passed away as a result of the coronavirus. But to get up there and say that, Republicans want people to die or Democrats want people to die, it's absurd.
We're all Americans at the end of the day, and
Yeah.
people that are just not thinking clearly with hysteria right now, they're not helping. They're not providing any solutions. They're just making more noise, which is hurting any efforts that we have going on right now.
And we can only hope that the Americans that are out there and the podcast listeners are truly listening to MSNBC, NBC, CNN, and Fox, so they can get kind of a truly balanced idea of what these people are saying.
Yeah.
That's what I do.
I always listen to the full spectrum.
So do I. So do I. And what I'm hearing
No
is
echo chamber.
the mainstream media is going crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, they're just going crazy because they see this as a winning issue, which is ridiculous because no
also-
one would want to win on this.
It's also a little frustrating to me because Scarborough is basically being the mouthpiece for the party who held up the Senate aid bill for an extra 4 days rather than just debate it during a procedural motion. And the logic just isn't consistent.
And Nancy, speaking of which, Nancy Pelosi has done just that. She had a deal with the Senate, and then she backed out of the deal because she wanted the Green New Deal included in this stimulus package, which ultimately sounds like it's going to be $2.2 trillion. Of course, it's an omnibus bill, so who the heck knows exactly what's in it until
There's going to be
it's
things
passed.
that no one's going to like in there.
The Wall Street Journal has an article on what's actually in it, and we're not going to go into that because we don't want to bore you.
I feel bad for whoever had to read that.
Oh, my
That's
God.
some just drudgy
And,
writing.
And the technocrats, of course, on the Hill who had to actually write this bill. I mean, I can't imagine having to do that for a living. But Nancy Pelosi, we have a clip on her about the final stimulus package. And this is classic Nancy Pelosi and Democrat Party, how they were holding the economy hostage. And then they turned right around and tried to put a spin on it. We have a clip on this. And here it is.
Last night, as you know, the Senate passed important legislation. We're very proud of the product. We think it is, we did jujitsu on it, that it went from a corporate first proposal that the Republicans put forth in the Senate to a workers first, Democratic workers first legislation. But let's first back up. As I was coming here, I saw that nearly 1,000 deaths in the United States, 900 yesterday, so I don't know what the number is today, but they're saying nearly 1,000 deaths in our country. Tens of thousands of people we have tens of thousands of cases. This is a pandemic that we haven't even seen for over 100 years in our country. It's really such a tragedy. So we had to take important action. We had to take action, though, that puts families first and workers first. And that's what we did when we did our first legislation. The first two bills were about addressing the emergency directly.
Yeah, so she put families first. That's why they put the Green New Deal, like subsidies, massive subsidies for green energy, like wind turbines and solar, as if that puts families first. It doesn't put families first because families right now, what do they need more than anything else?
A paycheck.
They need a paycheck. And many of them are not getting a paycheck. And families need a job. And they're worried that even when this paycheck that they're going to get from the government
Trying to keep the lights on.
runs out, they're not going to have a job to go back to. But of course, she is such an incredible liar, and the media just loves her. They never. Did you ask? I listened to the whole press conference with Nancy Pelosi.
Why did you
Not
do that to
a
yourself?
single media outlet asked her a critical question.
Jeez.
Not a single media outlet, such as, well, what happened to the Green New Deal part? Was that family first?
She just pisses me off. I mean, the part that really stands out to me, that really pissed me off, was where she sits and she's like, well, it started out as a Republican bill and then it turned into a Democrat bill. And why does it have to be a partisan bill? Why can't it just be an American bill? And it was unanimous in the Senate, and the idea that it's just got to be like one side won and one side lost. Look, like I'll admit I'm a reticent partisan pretty often. Like I've worked in Congress, I've worked at a legislature for candidates. I get how the whole process works, but for God's sakes, right now put it aside and let's work like human beings.
Let it go.
So the fact that she said Democrat workers first, like ideals or needs, is kind of interesting because like this. My understanding is the Senate, the first draft of the Senate stimulus bill drafted by Republicans and Democrats had workers first. Pretty much all like we gotta get these guys the paychecks. We need to send all this money.
The first person
we're willing to drop
for,
trillions of dollars to workers. It's like, wait, no, I think that was a bipartisan deal in the Senate. Then your very partisan House Democrats decided like we're just going to make it our own thing. And honestly, I think they're just counting the dead up once it's over, and it's going to bash the Republicans in the head, say you guys didn't act enough. But then again, it comes back to damned if you do, damned if you don't. And the shoe was on the other foot.
Agreed.
Give me a break. You guys like don't bring the deaths. Don't you people use because no one prepares for a pandemic.
Absolutely.
They don't know how bad you can prepare to a certain level, but that's a lot of money, a lot of time.
But
because you don't know how big it's going to get.
No, Ryan, those are great points, and not to mention that this is a pandemic that doesn't just go away in a couple of months. It's a pandemic that is going to recur probably when it gets cold again.
Secondary outbreaks. On top of that, we need to fight like smallpox.
It's
gonna be like the
unprecedented.
seasonal flu.
Yep.
It's going to be like the seasonal flu over again. There's going to be a coronavirus season, and hopefully by then, we have a flu shot for coronavirus and whatever.
And it's one and done. Hopefully it doesn't re-evolve like the flu does every year.
Absolutely. And speaking of the media going crazy, so NBC News has an article that the article just came out, and it's entitled, "As U.S. Struggles to Stem Coronavirus, China Asserts Itself as a Global Leader."
Give me
Jesus
a break.
Christ.
And it goes on to say, China is now working hard to position itself as the country that got out ahead on this virus, took extraordinary measures to contain it, and that saved a lot of lives
This reporter
abroad.
should register under FARA. Jesus Christ.
And that is now willing to
What a
share its
BS.
capabilities and its knowledge and its finances to help others around the world deal with it. Kenneth Lieberthal, Senior Fellow Emeritus at the Brookings Institution, said in the article.
Oh, jeez.
Now, to be fair, the article does go and it provides a little bit of balance, but really the whole article is slanted towards China's going to overtake us as the global leader because
That's what they want.
they're reaching out to Italy and to the rest of the world to help the world
Third world nations too.
with the coronavirus that they started.
Yeah.
that they let out. That
That's
they
right.
didn't take any steps to
Didn't
thoroughly
alert anybody.
address, hit it, persecuted the scientists and doctors who said this is going to be a big deal, and somehow we're supposed to act like because Jack Ma donates 1 million masks that China's like the global superpower that is a benevolent leader.
You know what has me kind of like if the Chinese government just did one simple thing, notify the World Health Organization, also known as WHO, like then I would take some of their actions like with some validity of truth to it.
Yes.
And on top of that, you already kind of talked about it a bit, but they're trying to be in the political science realm, the geopolitical hegemon, which the United States is right now.
Yep.
But they're controlling the means of production. They bought a lot of our debt when we had the recession back in the housing in 08 and 09. So they're waiting to cash in on that, which is going to give them a big bump up once we get our stuff righted. And on top of that, they're doing when we talk about like ways ago, the Belt of Pearls, where they're going to third world countries.
Belt Road, Belt Pearls,
Where they're building new highways connecting China to the rest of Europe, rail connecting China to the rest of Europe, and then now building shipyards and seaports, state-of-the-art seaports. Well, when China builds it, you can say state-of-the-art, quotation marks, to third world nations, giving them leases for like, I think, almost like 99 years or 100 years or more, where their Chinese military, once they build their Deep Blue Navy, which is basically a seafaring navy outside the regional waters,
that's why they're expanding into South China Sea rapidly. Yep.
And there's a concern about when the Bahamas got decimated by that one big storm a few years ago, that China is now investing to the Bahamas to get a new place in our backyard, almost have like a Russia-Cuba scenario.
Yeah, what they do is so for people who aren't familiar with what Belt Road is, China makes a giant investment into local infrastructure in very at-risk or developing countries, but they've set it at kind of a rate where the country and or the property holder could never pay back the loan, and then they seize it, and then they basically just make it a Chinese institution, and so that's how they get a lot of these property holdings in a lot of different countries.
And
Absolutely.
the fact that this is not like a recurring thing that our media is talking about, or even some of our leaders are doing it, but not to the degree that I think we need to do, because this is actually kind of concerning, because I would not want to live in a world where we have to Mother May I to actually operate globally to the Chinese government, because they censor Winnie the Pooh because we made fun of their leader I forget his name, Xi Jinping.
Xi Jinping, yeah.
Because he looked like Winnie the Pooh. They banned South Park. They ban everything they don't like. They're very sensitive. Do you think freedom of speech would fly when,
Of course not. How would you like their currency to be the world's reserve currency?
How would you like to be a
Yes, we would
Uyghur
be.
in China right now, where you're just basically forced into labor camps, the Chinese version of gulags for anybody who's like needs some kind of
Millions of
synonym,
people.
millions, and they're being reconditioned, whatever that means, to be good stewards of communism, which I think China is a far worse opponent than the Soviet Union could ever have been, because the Soviet Union was so ideologically driven towards a system of government that would never work.
And economically defunct.
And economically defunct. That China has actually learned from their mistake. They're, despite being authoritarian, they are predominantly capitalist.
They take the parts of the capitalism that likes, that works for them, because honestly, I think what terrifies them...
Layered by a massive surveillance state.
Yes.
Which I think what terrifies them when they look at our political system is how easily it is to target political leaders with just words and pieces against them, saying that's a bad thing, why do you do that? That terrifies them because they don't want to be held accountable for anything. They say, we know best, to shut up and do your thing.
Yep.
Exactly. And the other part of this podcast, you guys really segued into a great, is the new Cold War, which I think is the case. But before we get to that, Nevada's governor issues an emergency order barring the use of the anti-malaria drug for coronavirus patients. And so Governor Sisolak signed an emergency order on Tuesday barring the use of the anti-malaria drugs for someone who has the coronavirus disease. The order restricting chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine came after President Donald Trump touted the possibilities of the medication as a treatment, and falsely stated that the Food and Drug Administration had just approved the use of chloroquine to treat patients infected by the coronavirus. Sisolak said in a statement that there's no consensus among experts or Nevada doctors that the drugs can treat people with COVID-19, so therefore he's prohibiting its use in the state of Nevada.
Jesus Christ.
His reasoning is kind of, I can't buy it. Like, I could buy the reasoning saying maybe banning the use for certain patients, because there's, as we talked about in the last podcast, there's been a run for these two types of drugs.
Yes.
And people are stockpiling it when people with autoimmune diseases, they
like
can't
lupus,
get their drugs.
they
Can't get the drugs. They've been on that drug for years, decades. The drug's been around for 70 plus years, and some manufacturers stopped making it. And I think Bayer donated like 3 million tablets of chloroquine to the U.S. government to have them dole out and stockpile it.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, Nevada's chief medical officer is not licensed to practice medicine in the U.S.
Wait, what?
Nevada's top doctor.
Sounds a little...
He's licensed to practice. He's not licensed to practice medicine in the U.S. Nevada's top doctor, Ihsan Azam, testified in Las Vegas on Tuesday that he has a master's degree and worked for several years in environmental public policy and epidemiology, before being named chief state medical officer last May. He says he practiced for several years as an as a gynecology physician in Africa before moving to the U.S. in the 90s. And he goes on to basically say that, he has no background in anesthesia or pain management. And apparently the reason this is relevant is because he was basically saying that there are doses of 3 drugs proposed for an inmate's lethal injection in California, and it will be enough to kill a woolly mammoth. So he weighed in on this in court. Meanwhile, he has no medical degree and no background in anesthesiology.
Well,
how did he get his job? That's the first question.
Lethal injection, the 3 drugs are the one that knocks you out, one gives you a painkiller, and then it's the dose of potassium that shocks your heart,
Yep.
and then you just...
Exactly. And then before we go to the new Cold War in China, we have a trending thing in Twitter, kind of a not so funny thing if you're a boomer.
Sorry.
But of course, the millennials love it. And namely,
I like dark humor.
It's trending on Twitter is the term boomer remover.
First, okay, boomer, now this.
And of course, my comment is talk about cancel culture, right? Thanks a lot, millennials. Let's kill all the boomers off so we can inherit the earth and inherit all their money.
Yeah, we won't social distance. We'll give you a nice big bear hug.
So it began trending on Twitter last Friday. And
the boomer
and
remover.
the term has appeared in more than 65,000 tweets and references the higher mortality rate among older people infected with COVID-19. as opposed to the millennials. Thanks,
Where
millennials.
were you during the great boomer remover of 2020?
Not nice. That's all I'm saying.
I was in my living room watching Netflix.
Yeah, you're watching Tiger King. That's where you're probably
Liberals
doing.
everywhere got to be relishing in this. They get to sit home and do nothing while boomers just disappear. Wow, jeez.
And then you go out and it's
blue
like,
wave.
now we're in charge. Oh, wow. Broadcast yourself. So, the new Cold War, right? Sam Faddis, he has his own podcast, and he also produces A&D magazine. Sam Faddis. He's an expert in international relations. He's a former retired CIA operations officer and a publisher, author, and national security commentator. In addition to writing, speaking, and teaching, he consults for the U.S. military, U.S. government, and private industry. Sam graduated from Johns Hopkins and the University of Maryland School of Law. And we have several clips from him about what I think is really happening in China. And you can make your own judgment as a listener of this podcast. I think he's right on because this guy has been right on international issues because I read his magazine. It's a terrific magazine, great podcast. We have the first clip up about what's really happening in mainland China. And here is the first clip.
We have determined, the press has determined, that something like 21 million cell phone accounts were deleted from the Chinese cell phone system over the last 3 months.
Jeez.
Now, just to make sure that that's clear, the significance is clear, China practices a very tight system of social control. And one of the ways it does that is by basically requiring you to use a QR code generated on your cell phone to pay for pretty much everything. Cash is generally not used. Credit cards aren't used. You have to use your cell phone. You have to carry it. And it has to be monitored at all times. This way the Chinese government knows where you are, what you're doing, what you're buying, who you're talking to. This is part of a system of control on the part of the Communist Party. So it's not like you can pick or choose whether you want to have a cell phone, get rid of your account, change carriers. Somehow 21 million such accounts have vanished in the last few months. Now, one explanation would obviously be that 21 million people just died. I think everybody finds that a little hard to believe, and yet it's still a completely unexplained phenomenon, and particularly troubling because the internet has been flooded for a long time with video coming out of China from cremation sites showing the piles, literally piles of cell phones from people who had died and been cremated, being shoveled up, swept up, and disposed of. We're talking cell phones by the thousands.
So there you have it. So we did report on this previously in the last podcast. The difference is this time we have Sam Faddis and his very up-to-date podcast about what's happening inside of mainland China. Mm-hmm. And first of all, he's talking about the fact that in China, you have to have a cell phone. You have to at all times because the government wants to know where you are, who you're talking to, and they're assigned QR codes. So millennials, what is a QR code? What is its purpose as it relates to a place like China?
The simplest way of describing a QR code is basically like a different form of a barcode. It's that square thing that you see on a lot of products, and you get a QR code reader on your phone. This is the way it's used generally.
Would it be unique to the person?
Well, that's the Chinese thing. I was just going to give you the foundational about the QR codes that we generally use. Usually you have a QR code reader on your phone. Mm-hmm. Basically, you open it up, you find the QR code, you put your phone over it with the camera, it locks in, and then it gives you information displayed. It's stored in that code. So when the Chinese government is using for QR codes, basically saying, your cell phone is your QR code, identifies who you are, your financial status, where you work. Basically, it probably gives you your whole life history, knowing
your
how the
social
Chinese
profile.
Basically give you your whole thing. So to pay and live and breathe in the Chinese government, you have to use your phone with your QR code, and you go to scanners. Like you probably use that to get scanned to a metro stop, or when you buy a cup of coffee, or
so instead of like a driver's license, which a police officer in the United States would, let's say, pull you over.
Yeah.
Or maybe he would be in a bar and to see if you are underage or overage or whatever the case may be. In China, they're using the QR code for the purposes of, and cell phones for the purpose of identification and surveillance.
It puts all the contents of our American wallet just on a little code on your cell phone.
But basically, with your whole profile and your financial and all that stuff, it's basically giving you, it's allowing them to obviously gather intelligence about you and your personality and your preferences and who you're, as Sam Fatt said, talking to.
Because there is no privacy.
No.
Yes.
All that data gets reported to the CCP, who then uses it for whatever purpose they want to, social tracking, who, what, when, where you are, et cetera, et cetera.
Like, granted, we kind of give away our privacy when we use services like Facebook, Instagram, and social media to a degree, but not as nefarious or insidious as the Chinese government wants to do, because you're actually opting into using these programs.
Yeah, there's a difference between Facebook trying to market me products it thinks I would like, and the Chinese Communist Party rounding me up for, saying unsympathetic things to the Chinese Communist Party.
And so Faddis was reporting, as we've read other reports, that 21 million cell phones have just disappeared.
Yeah.
And this is data that we can follow for a variety of reasons, especially if you're in the, if you're a former CIA officer, because obviously Sam Faddis talks to his former officers, and they all talk to each other. And there are pictures coming out of China, according to Faddis, whereby you have mountains of these phones that they're trying to bury and or incinerate, and incinerators that have been working 24/7 to allegedly, of course, burn bodies of people that have perished from COVID-19. And he's also, and I would imagine, and by the way, I haven't seen this in the media yet, I would imagine that our satellites are following this as well, that we're literally, because you know how good these satellites are now with being able to zero in on what's actually happening in countries. But the mainstream media really isn't reporting this, I would imagine, in part because they don't want the American people to panic about what's happening in China and the potential of what could happen here, at least with respect to the number of deaths. Obviously, the Chinese handle things differently, which is why we're talking about this. So, but we have a second clip from Sam Faddis. We have 3 clips altogether. This is the second of 3. Believe me, folks, this is worth listening to. This is really interesting stuff.
It's an interesting
and here
perspective.
Is the clip.
Right now, the Chinese economy is crashing and burning.
Oh, yeah.
It is collapsing. Chinese government is selling off bonds to desperately raise foreign currency and capital. It has no choice but to restart the economy. It has no choice but to put people back in factories and put them back to work, because if it doesn't, they're done. Because the people
good outcome
will take care of it themselves.
Ideal.
And the days of the CCP will be numbered. So this narrative that the virus is controlled, that everything's returning to normal, and that everybody's going back to work, no matter how suicidal, is essentially one that the communists have no choice but to adopt.
So they have to adopt this in China, because when you have 1.35 billion people, you have a manufacturing sector which is certainly massive, the largest in the world. You have to put people back to work, because there's this unsteady deal between the communist government and the people that is, hey, as long as your lives keep getting better, keep us here. And of course, the Chinese communists are going to make sure that they stay there, because they're going to use the military to do so, and absolute fear and terror and their surveillance state to stay in charge. But Faddis's point is that the Chinese government would be done if they go into a Great Depression or any kind of depression. And that's why they have to put people back to work.
I think there's 2 dynamics to that, too. I mean, first of all, there's the interrelationship between the Chinese people and the Communist Party as a whole, but there's also the Xi government and the rest of the Communist Party dynamic, whereas Xi had been kind of skating on thin ice. He's been probably the longest-serving premier of China for a very long time, and I'm sure there's a lot of communists in the high-ups in the party waiting in line who would really like that opportunity, and they see this as a weak, and Xi probably sees this as a referendum on his leadership, and so he's trying to protect his stake in all of this as well.
Yeah, removed from power in a communist regime is not the best way to go out.
No, you're probably killed,
bullet in the
of course,
back of the
probably
head.
murdered.
Yeah, because you are influential still.
Well, look what he's put up with. He's had Hong Kong, the riots in Hong Kong, and then he has COVID-19.
The Uyghur issue in the national media.
And he also has the President of the United States, who basically is
Started a
renegotiating
war
trade
with
agreements
him.
and put tariffs on China and calling Chinese out for their IP theft. But the interesting thing is just like the Soviet Union, look, when the Berlin Wall fell, when it fell, and the Soviet Union fell as a country, And of course, all of their satellite states fell as well. Certainly, China was not a satellite state of the Soviet Union, but all the other satellite states in Eastern Europe fell.
Terrified them.
The fact of the matter is, the reason it fell is because the economy fell apart. The economy collapsed in the Soviet Union.
You couldn't get anything.
Because there was only so long you could lie to people about the fact that things were going to get better, and the economy collapsed. And in China, that is the only way I think that the Chinese government is going to be overthrown. It would be overthrown internally. I'm not sure what would come afterwards would be that much better, but certainly having more transparency would be a good thing. Because right now, as you guys can see, we have a former CIA operations officer we have to listen to find out what we think or what he thinks is happening in China. So we have a third clip with Sam Faddis. Folks, this is really worth listening to. It's pretty amazing. And this is why I think we're going to be engaged in a new Cold War if China does get out of this. But here is the third clip.
And you can imagine what is going to happen when they begin to herd literally hundreds of millions of people back into crowded dormitory conditions and back onto factory floors, and they don't, in fact, have control over this virus. What it's going to mean is that this second wave of lies is going to lead to a second wave of the virus, perhaps worse than the first.
Yes. So if you're China and you're Xi, you're the premier of the Communist Party, then you have to get people back to work, because if you don't, then the people can't afford, of course, to live. They can't. There's no production when you have 1.35 billion. Where's the food going to come from? Where are the products going to come from? Where's the energy going to come from? And he's basically saying that when that happens, people are working in close quarters just because obviously there's so many people that live in China. The whole COVID-19 issue is going to rear its ugly head again. They're going to have a second wave, which could potentially be worse than the first, because instead of being regionalized, it will be nationalized. And at that particular point in time, you could have revolution. And this is something that, and by the way, you know what happens to Chinese regimes? You know what happens to, communist regimes when they are threatened by their own people?
Brutality.
They end up not just engaging in brutality, Garrick, but they also end up trying to start a war somewhere to refocus the attention.
Oh, I mean, you already see them playing the blame game when it comes to coronavirus. The lines that they're peddling around the international community is that this is a United States Army issue, and that we had coronavirus in Seattle 2 years ago and we never addressed it, and now it's all over China as a result, and it's our fault.
And the problem is with the whole notion of the next Cold War is that a lot of I do have issues with businesses selling basically similar parts that we use in our military apparatus. You have to look it up, but basically if you look at the Chinese attack helicopter, it looks really like our Apache, whatever version, Apache Longbow, because guess what? Pratt & Whitney made the Apache engine for that helicopter frame, sold the same engine to the Chinese. And it's like, what do you guys expect? Why are you selling the same engine that's going to be used, that was developed for the Apache, to the Chinese? And you see the same thing with our aircraft, our stealth fighters. They're using the same thing. Granted, they're probably not the same quality, because I think they're selling them off to India right now because they don't want to use them anymore. But still, you see this buildup of military arms to combat, or at least look similar to what we have.
Absolutely.
And the ground has been laid for this new Cold War. And I think if you've been very interested at home about international relations and foreign affairs, you've seen China as the predominant global threat for a long time now. But for a lot of people, I think this is going to be the first that they're really exposed to truly the reality of this situation. And I think that, to Trump's credit, he got it right with the tariff situation. Because to a lot of people, like free marketers and things like that, it's tough to balance cheap goods and readily available, just free supply chains and things like that with the circumstances from a hegemonic position. And I think that Trump's realization that China was taking advantage of us in terms of intellectual property as well as trade deals and the whole lot has put us in a position where we can really address China as a negligent superpower.
Absolutely. And I believe that when the United States emerges from this COVID-19 emergency and this pandemic, that you're going to see President Trump put the pedal to the metal, which is going to cause the new Cold War. And the pedal to the metal will be to basically pull industries back to the United States.
Incentivize them to even go other places.
Whereas before it was mainly, hey, let's continue trade, but it has to be fair and free trade, and you can't steal IP anymore, China. Now it's going to be, oh, by the way, we want these industries back in the United States, and we basically want to deindustrialize China with American industries and American internet, American IP. Excuse me.
China wasn't a tech player for decades until they started recently artificially leapfrogging their technology gap by stealing all our intellectual property, especially from Cisco. That's where you see where everyone's connecting it to the growth of Huawei, and then the fact that actually other governments around the world are considering buying Huawei 5G stuff. Granted, there may be a backdoor, there may not be, or I just wouldn't be comfortable buying a Chinese product where the Chinese government has a thumb in all these industries.
Sure, and I do believe this. Look, I believe that if we were to move forward with this, if Trump does this, it's going to be by design that China could collapse. They could collapse, obviously, if Americans basically just stop buying Chinese products. And then we could cause, of course, a revolution inside of China. Quite frankly, it's better that happens now than later, before this country becomes the hegemon. And it's
we're trying to do it by the 100-year anniversary, 1944, I think,
1945. It's frightening.
And the thing is, though, it's like we should be manufacturing independent, just like we became oil independent.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Garrick. Any final thoughts on the new Cold War with China before we go to the dumbest bill in America?
Oh, there's so many. But what I will say is I am encouraged by this realization. I really do think that this is going to be something that will be addressed globally. But I am also disheartened that, like Ryan talked about, that there are a lot of Western governments who are indifferent and appeasing almost the Chinese regime. You know, Germany is a big one.
Because they're not resource rich.
Yeah, and they're relying on Huawei, other resource industries from China, and I'd like to see a lot of that changed. And
yeah, we don't want surveillance companies coming into the United States and have
for
the Chinese
better or for
surveilling
worse, we have been a benevolent superpower hegemon for the last 60 years. You know, we don't run around, oppressing, Western countries, third world countries with, brutality.
We usually don't get involved in conflicts unless we get attacked and we strike back.
Or it's in our own backyard.
Yep.
Yeah, but the difference is that China is sneaking up on us, as you guys know, and by the way, you guys have done a great job talking about this issue of the new Cold War. But here's the thing. Here's the takeaway for our podcast listeners. Millennials, this is the world that you're inheriting. You're inheriting the world of the new Cold War.
Thanks, Boomer.
And hey, we got rid of the Soviet Union, right?
Yeah.
We got Putin, but he's basically got the economy of Venezuela, but with a big gas can.
Putin actually makes this an interesting part of the discussion. I know we're pressed for a little bit for time, so I'll keep it short. But it's not just enough to smash the regime; it's what you do after that's very important. It's how do you deal with it? Because in the Soviet Union we had Yeltsin, and it didn't really work, and then that's how you got Putin and this return to
absolutely
Soviet sentiments.
Yeah. Okay, the KGB basically back in charge.
Yep.
Except that look,
defending
China.
Russians.
What we have in the former Soviet Union, the new Russia, if you will, is far better than the Soviet Union because of the fact that at least we don't have missiles pointing at each other to the point that we have the mutually assured destruction at any second.
Duck and cover.
Absolutely. So next up, we have the dumbest bill in America. It's the dumbest bill in America, and Mr. Assistant Producer Christopher Hopkins, do we have our lead up?
Of course.
Here it is.
So wait a minute. What you're saying is that you want us to put water on the crops.
Yes.
Water. Like out the toilet?
Well, I mean, it doesn't have to be out of the toilet, but yeah, that's the idea. But Brondo's got what plants crave.
It's got electrolytes.
So, of course, that's from the infamous cult following of Idiocracy, the cult movie Idiocracy, which is really funny. Democracy Gone Awry. And we love that lead up. So look, the dumbest bill in America is actually an update on the dumbest bills in America, and that is the plastic bag ban throughout the United States. So as you know, podcast listeners, we've had plastic bag bans in various states across the country. And then now we have, fast forward, the COVID-19 pandemic. And guess what's happening? Is governors across the country whose states have plastic bag bans are saying, wait a minute, we're going to suspend the local plastic bag bans and or the statewide plastic bag ban because plastic bags are actually very clean as opposed to reusable bags. So, as part of a new order governing public health at grocery stores and pharmacies, Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker said Wednesday he's lifting the state and local bans on plastic bags and is prohibiting, listen to this, is prohibiting shoppers from carrying out groceries in reusable bags.
Oh, wow.
Because from now on, reusable bags are prohibited and all regulations on plastic bags will be lifted, Baker said, according to CBS Boston. Stores are not allowed to charge for paper and plastic bags at this time. So
Plastics
we've had a
impervious.
complete reversal of, the woke plastic bag ban saying, oh, by the way, they're actually clean and they might keep you alive.
Yeah, they're impervious.
Yes, well, not to mention the reusable bags, you had to keep washing them, as you basically were alluding to. And then Maine Governor Janet Mills announced that enforcement of the state's new law banning plastic bag use is due to go into effect on April 22nd. It's going to be delayed until next January 2021, for the same exact reason as the governor of Massachusetts. So that was Maine Governor Janet Mills.
I like how their thing is we're just going to push off the implementation, because it's not like we haven't just really deduced that it's a bad policy for certain practical aspects and it probably shouldn't be there. It's just, it's not applicable for right now. We'll do it later.
Exactly.
I think it just misses
We're
the
still
whole
going to
point
bring
there.
it back because, it's a great policy. I mean,
So what are we going to do when if this ever happens again, or there's some kind of public health issue? We just going to,
yeah, we might have a run. It's like no one makes plastic bags anymore. So then it's like, what are we supposed to do?
Bags. Look at what we're doing.
Exactly. So with identified community transmission, it's important that shoppers keep their reusable bags at home, given the potential risk to baggers, grocers, and customers, said New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu, who recently tweeted that. The Granite State, by the way, New Hampshire, does not have a bag ban. But obviously, he's basically piling on saying, thank goodness we don't have a bag ban. And then, last but not least, is who we're getting to, is the state of Maryland.
Yes.
By the way, I have to give kudos to Josh Kurtz. Josh Kurtz is a writer for Maryland Matters. Josh and I have had many arguments over the years, and he tends to be a very left-leaning, to say the least, reporter. But he reported all these stories that I'm telling about, he reported in Maryland Matters. And here's my favorite of the plastic bag ban bills. Delegate Brooke Learman, Democrat, Baltimore City, the chief sponsor of plastic bag legislation that would ban plastic bags throughout the state of Maryland, said next year she intends to reintroduce the measure.
It didn't pass this year.
Because this year, her measure to ban plastic bags did not pass. She's going to reintroduce it next year, in spite of all of the evidence of all of these governors across the country who were basically saying, no, these bans are not a good idea because of public health. She's going to do it anyway because she's just so ideological and, quite honestly, stupid.
The delegate has been proposing this bill for the past few years, if I'm not mistaken.
It's like year 4.
Yeah, it's like year 4, but it did pass out of the House in Maryland, but it died in the Senate. But she's going to bring it back in spite of all of the evidence to the contrary. So, well, that's it for Mark and the Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our Millennials, Garrick Ross, Ryan the Squirrel Brady, and of course our producer Adam Couture and our assistant producer Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and our website. See you next time.